Would you still love me if I was a worm? Fuck no, but I should. So today I'm going to discuss what it means to be anti-chick flick and why you can't escape being a chick flick in an attempt to reject its tropes. The laws of the chick flick build such a prison around how your emotions are supposed to behave that trying to break out by using a crippled, nearsighted minority as a hostage would only affirm the structure that says that you need to be as unfree as possible. And in trying to break out of the chick flick prison to create such stories as the Metamorphosis or Boogie Nights, it makes my job mapping out the structure of a chick flick far easier. Depending on the flaws in the prison you took advantage of, I can reinforce what made the chick flick so deliciously sappy in the first place. By checking for spoon carvings in the wall, putting more barbed wire on the fence to make sure it's always more painful to not get back together. Anyway, so let's talk about why we get back together and what unconscious forces drive the plot towards closure. So first of all, there is only one boundary that cannot be tested in a chick flick. Many other things can be put to the test to prove how much somebody cares or honored to show a world in which this closure doesn't exist. But ultimately, this closure is required to exist. So this one boundary is that there can be no abandonment. As Trent Reznor says, we're in this together. Now, the story doesn't have to be told from the closure perspective of a woman, but since men are a lot more willing to rationalize their fundamental need for affirmation away, the cinematic, open display of wanting affirmation is usually passed off to the sex that's healthier at emotional regulation. Chick flicks are almost never written from an emotional third person, and by that I mean it can be third person, but everyone's actions and agendas, although described as if they have them all for themselves as much for the closure-needing protagonist, have their actions and agendas especially tailored to create opportunities for the protagonist to express themselves. So this is why abandonment is against the rules. The closure-needing protagonist, who for brevity I'll rename DNMPS, which stands for Don't Need My Problem Solved, the DNMPS is the source of all of the motivation. If the other characters have motivations, it's a part of a larger unconscious plot from the original motivation. So everything that isn't direct motivation in a story is where that motivation is stored. And psychoanalysis has a word for the storage, actually. The unconscious. Whatever doesn't leave the unconscious via expression stays in the unconscious to seethe and plot. There's a reason games are necessary in chick flicks. You cannot express yourself correctly unless people create opportunities for you, either by provoking it out or intentionally misunderstanding something so you can correct yourself. Expression feels the most comfortable and justifiable defensively. Because if it's not expression out of standing up for yourself, it's as if your feelings aren't holding something in the world accountable for victimizing you in a clear cause and effect. If you're in a position where expressing yourself without an external prompt makes you seem like it's mostly holding something inside yourself accountable, you won't feel as justified. And justification for feeling is necessary for expression, even though feeling exists without justification in the lawless land of human nature. So this is why all of the characters that the DNMPS have fantasized to give them justification cannot abandon her. Your unconscious cannot abandon you, because if the guy that embodied the girl's sorrow abandoned her, the repression would have nowhere to be stored, and her unconscious wouldn't exist and she'd never have to hint at something ever again. God, this sounds so fucking resentful. What the fuck is this? This is an old script. Alright, so notice how many DSMPSs don't quite know what they want, but yet there's a story structure that her repressions using the fiction world as a host have meticulously designed in a several-act conflict, while largely the structure of a story is driven by a simple unconscious formula that I'll demonstrate. So whatever needs the DNMPS doesn't have met is stored in her unconscious, which is the story itself. So far so good, the story is just one axis, which is repression, but repression is always striving for escape. So it takes apart the Jenga blocks of the harmony of the story because all repressions are unstable buildings. Or rather, the thing repressions are inside of are unstable. The repressions can't fall apart, but an unconscious can since there's only so much stuff it can hold that's trying to clamber its way out. In its extreme, this is psychosis. Ever seen a psychotic person repress their uncomfortable ideas? No, their feelings are homeless and all out there for people to see. So let's talk about taking out the Jenga blocks. Conflicts in stories happen, little thing by little thing piling up. So when the tower collapses, it's some form of karma or justification that allows expression. And the character in the world can be blamed for taking apart the pieces in some self-aware act of playing with fire. So whatever approach they had becomes the moral of what not to do despite it just being unconscious forces trying to escape without any morality involved. The Bible tends to follow this archetype. A new judge is appointed, and then his folly exiles him, and a new judge who will invariably repeat the failures replaces him, because there's always more to repress. Notice how right off the bat in Genesis, repression is aching to express itself, and makes the perfectness of man faulty using original sin. This time, biting the apple is what finally removes the foundation from the Jenga tower. If the Garden of Eden is the unconscious structure, it needs to have a tree of knowledge planted in it so repressions can have some oxygen. Because otherwise, if humans aren't imperfect, how can the DNMPS ever manifest their repressions? Now, God is the third person who always sides with the moral that exposes how the tower was taken apart, and by extension, he opposes repression manifestation as a whole. Human darkness should not be integrated, and instead we should ignore, push down, and write commandments against its attempts at escape. That's why things are constantly going to shit in the Bible. Satan is getting more and more provocative with each commandment written. Goddamn, I didn't know the Bible was a chick flick. Anyway, let's talk about anti-chick flicks. Unironically? Jesus fucking Christ. Unironically, Franz Kafka's Metamorphosis is the best example of would you love me if I was a fucking worm? Bitch, I wouldn't love you if you were a giant cockroach. And all of Kafka's main characters are clearly him, and Gregory Samsa of the Metamorphosis first thing in the story is a giant bug for some reason. It doesn't particularly matter why, as the question, would you love me if I were a worm, assumes that the person that loves them will give them the answer that allows expression and not, well, what did you do for the wish to turn you into a bug? And will you have the brain regions to love me back? So the Metamorphosis is all about what it takes to be abandoned, and it turns out for Kafka the answer is object permanence. What the fuck are the Samsas supposed to assume? That the massive roach is Gregory because that's where he was left? There's no other indication that the vermin piece of shit bootlicking no self-esteem Austrian is the same entity as the roach. The only continuity between those two persons is Greg's bedroom, which is where his family goes to tell him to go to work. And man, if they don't care about the emotional state of Gregory enough to care what thing exactly is going to work, except that he does, in spite of what doesn't matter, and that it comes from a bedroom, the roach and human Greg are only the same insofar as that's what's supposed to have gone to work. So initially, the roach of indiscriminate motivation is kept alive out of pure guilt that that's what Greg once was. They're keeping the idea of Greg alive. But ideas only last as long as their hosts give you things, and roaches can't. Bro, a roach ain't gonna take you fine dining. So due to pure negligence, Greg dies alone and in squalor. Normally, grief follows, but they've already grieved the idea of Greg the moment he couldn't go to work. So now that a bug that over time has lost its continuity to Greg has died arbitrarily, they're not saddened about him. So here's the problem with Kafka's rejection of chick flicks. He wants to be cared about if he was turned into a worm. The mere fact that his repressions took out a Jenga block, forming him inexplicably into a roach, means his repression was seeking for social validation. They damn well know every problem imaginable would happen if they did a cheap hypothetical. And for their repressions, it worked. They clawed their way out of the roach, destroying all social harmony in its path and leaving the corpse of what had escaped used and forlorn. And that's the whole point of the Metamorphosis. The roach might be dead, but it got what it deserved, and Greg got what he wanted. So you're Greg, right? Your family doesn't care about you. The next best thing is to disappear from the world completely, and in the perfect crime, swap yourself for a hypothetical. The roach is the real victim here, as he was created specifically to be misunderstood, as emotionally manipulative statements often are. If Gregory is stagnant in life, his repressions are going to ascend or descend with or without him. Think about how people that are of the ending it all variety, how they often leave notes that intentionally open up a conversation for closure despite not being able to. It's because they want the conversation that follows to be somebody else's lack of closure. So hypotheticals like, what if I was turned into a roach, are written to dehumanize every character inside the hypothetical to give somebody else a problem to solve. But here's the thing, Kafka was right. We are hypothetical roaches used as emotional manipulation. Or at least we were. That's right, we're talking about abortion. What the fuck is a fetus besides a very Lynchian Primus-sounding word? Well, a fetus is something you keep, or you don't. Other than that, a fetus stays the same, doesn't have character changes, doesn't give you feedback, doesn't reciprocate or form relationships. And I suppose this is what somebody means when they say a fetus is a bundle of cells. Not that we aren't bundles of cells, but without real-world relationships where affirmation is exchanged and people have personas, You're just a bundle of cells. But I find this actually missing the point. So by saying something is a bundle of cells, really what's being argued about is whether fetuses have bargaining chips in the moral conversation. Pro-choicers say no, pro-lifers say yes. But there's a deeper conversation both aren't consciously waging. Fundamentally, pro-lifers aren't actually arguing that fetuses have bargaining chips, but that they will. And that's not a matter of philosophy. A fetus is something that is bargained over, not something that bargains on its own behalf. So the only thing that a fetus can use to bargain isn't even from the fetus, but from the mother's fantasy of the fetus, which is an appeal to conscience. There's a reason why there is a canonical conscience for the suffering of a toddler and a subjective conscience for the fantasy of a fetus. And that's because that's exactly the only way we can observe a fetus is through fantasy, not sensory information. And that's problematic when trying to use morality to solve the problem. So actually, a fetus couldn't be farther from just a bundle of cells. Functionally, it's more of your concept of it than something that can be understood through measurement. Alright, so this is the measurement argument. This is when heartbeat, and this is when life. And ultimately, these measurements do nothing to contradict the moral position of either side because it's the subjective fantasy of the fetus that founds their argument. So when we bargain over what happens to a societally integrated human, something called a criminal trial, we use that person's intentions and relationship with the community to decide its fate. But what intention does a fetus have besides the one that you project onto it for your own agenda? A fetus is a parasite, or a fetus is a cute, vulnerable pre-infant. A fetus's job is to be misunderstood and have words put into its mouth. Now remember what happened to the giant roach. There was two responses to it, guilt or apathy. Pro-lifers have a guilty fantasy, and pro-choicers have an apathetic fantasy. So that's not to say that pro-choicers don't have a conscience that bosses them around into doing things they don't want to do by threatening them with feeling bad. It's just a question of how imaginative is your conscience. Essentially, there's only one reason you would do something for somebody else when there's no reciprocal action involved, and that's your conscience, which is sort of like a compact friend group shaming you as a failsafe for when you make moral decisions all by yourself. Now, the amount of fantasy and the amount of transaction involved in your relationship with somebody is usually balanced, so your fantasy doesn't totally define who they are and how much value they have, since sometimes they have as much value as they have things to offer, and consequences they have to inflict. Now, I assume a woman aborts a baby not because they're thinking about right and wrong, but in spite of it, as in spite of conscience. So the fetus is aborted fundamentally because it's what they wanted to do, and the only reason you wouldn't do what you want to do is because of the compact morality whispering to you in your head. Goddamn, my voice is dying. My voice is dying! Would you love me if I was a fetus? If loving you was what I wanted to do? Since the fantasy of what a fetus is directly woven by your unconscious feelings, if your unconscious feelings wanted to not be a mother, your fantasy would create a version of a fetus not deserving of infancy. And this exists outside of morality specifically because how useful something is in terms of negotiation creates tangible moral truths. Like, if you steal, you're an asshole, and unuseful, regardless of fantasy. In fact, the only truth about a fetus is that it goes wherever the mother goes. That being the supermarket, or the abortion clinic, or the club. Which is why when bargaining over it, it has to be seen as morally truthful insofar as it is an accessory to the mother. All attacks over the fetus's ability to live are centered on the fetus as an accessory more than a thing in and of itself. And just like how God opposes whatever force took apart the Jenga blocks, the insecure parts of a Jenga tower's stability is pathologized when morally criticizing the other side. And honestly, the moral tendency of going after people's insecurities is something I find gross. So if the fetus had bargaining chips, then we'd go after its insecurities because that's the only way to cope with others' ability to control. Now, there's a reason there's never been a chick flick written from the perspective of a fetus. Stay with me here. A fetus is something that exclusively exists as a thing that gives others closure. If a story revolved around a fetus using a pro-lifer and pro-choicer as its unconscious where it stores its repressions, then why doesn't that work? Well, first of all, if you have nothing to transactionally offer, you only exist to be somebody else's unconscious, as a fetus can't bribe a transaction in exchange for having its humanity understood. So what do you call the image of your crush that doesn't push back on your fantasy of them? Well, whatever you want them to be, basically. It's your story alone. Here's what I'm getting at. External validation. So before you were even born, the validity of your existence hinged on what others wanted you to affirm. And as an infant, you're just a continuation of that fantasy. The only way you can get validation from your mother is if you mimic the fantasy she has of you, so she can recognize something worth validating in exchange for seeing her fantasy validate what you're supposed to be. This cycle couldn't have chosen a more vulnerable species, because a baby human is unnaturally weak. They can't develop a fantasy of themselves because the only thing they're designed to do is need help. Seriously, what is there to fantasize about except the unconscious motivation of the help you receive? And so you wind up being something that is still bargained over and that doesn't bargain on themselves. Most animals are born semi-self-sufficient, and into adulthood they stay sufficient as they need to be. But adult humans don't want sufficiency because their whole self-perception was founded actually on being helpless and up for negotiation. So once we actually become able to fend and with our intellect control, we're still helpless by self-perception, but jealous that we weren't the person that was fantasizing our own value. So our ego is characterized by being greater than competent, something that gets to decide how things work and what competent things become irrelevant with manipulating the system. A fetus needs social validation in the sense that its self-preservation is the underlying force of its existence. The mother's fantasy is the only thing that affects its ability to self-preserve. It's not that the fetus understands that, but it was evolved to have that pre-programmed in how it will develop. So for the question of, would you love me if I was a worm? If I said yes, I'm dehumanizing you into my fantasy of how much value you have. Better question than what will it take for you to give me permission to have value is how can I love myself? And you shouldn't love yourself. Let me explain. So how much value you have, by definition, is something that is used to bargain, because you're as valuable as you have consolation to offer, and the basis of morality is how can people negotiate their value by attacking unconscious forces escaping points of insecurity. If you can't bargain what your value is like a fetus, you don't participate in morality. Sorry. So when you say I love myself as opposed to I hate myself, your self-esteem is literally coming from the insecurity that's used to revoke values in others. How about don't love yourself because your value is something that is bargained over? How about don't hate yourself because you have insecurity and weakness where the foil to your control exists? You shouldn't love or hate yourself since you have a value that exists outside of your own approval. And things like sin, temptation, and insecurity is how repressions can foster the growth and authenticity in your nature. There's two versions of what you are to others: fantasy and transaction. Here's how you escape a fantasy and transaction-based morality. Don't be jealous of the ability to decide how much value you have, because you have the opportunity to help somebody else not be a fantasy instead, to grant them their nature and celebrate their helplessness and insecurity. Don't try to push back on somebody else's fantasy of you with transaction. Instead, do what's useful for its own sake, and not to pander others' approval. They can rot with your fantasy of you, as you aren't even intimate with that fantasy anyways. Remember, always be empathetic. Other people are not there for you to project onto, but there for you to imagine their nature because it's novel and unlike your motivations. Thank you and bye. I will personally respond to any comment with an audio reply, since it's just fucking funny. Subscribe if you want. I'm going to be releasing a short story here soon. It's going to be called The Empath Detective. It's going to be kind of thematically similar to what I've been talking about here, but more in like a fiction form. See you guys. Bye.